The heavy oak doors of the servants' entrance groaned, admitting a woman whose regal bearing was hidden beneath a coarse, gray uniform. Celestia Solara pulled her shawl tight, her eyes scanning the familiar, polished corridors of her son's palace. She was no longer the Queen Mother, she was Marta, a ghost in the machine. As she navigated the shadows, the silence of the hall felt heavy, stifling. Somewhere behind these walls, the court was weaving a trap, and her son was none the wiser. Today, the Queen Mother would unmask the rod, one whisper at a time. For 3 decades, Celestia Solara had been the iron backbone of the Solara dynasty, governing through chaos that would have crumbled lesser monarchs. She had navigated the treacherous waters of border wars and backroom alliances, only stepping away when her son, King Orion, ascended the throne. She had built a legacy forged in discipline and foresight, a legacy she believed was safe in the hands of the man she had trained to rule. But intuition is a quiet, persistent advisor, and Celestia's had begun to scream. It wasn't the choice of Queen Luna Vesper that troubled her. Celestia had seen the girl's potential, a fierce, quiet brilliance that mirrored her own youth. No, the danger wasn't in Luna. It was in the palace itself. Celestia knew the scent of a coup, and lately, the letters from the capital carried the stale, hollow air of orchestrated silence. She recognized the pattern, the slow, systematic erosion of a queen's influence by a court that viewed kindness as a weakness to be exploited. Living in the tranquil solitude of the Solara estates, hundreds of miles from the throne, Celestia realized that formal inquiries would only be met with scripted denials. The palace was a closed loop of sycophants. If she wanted the truth, if she wanted to reach the heart of the rot before Luna was fully broken, she could not return as the Queen Mother. She would have to go back as something invisible. By dawn, she had traded her regal silks for the rough, heavy weave of a common maid, her face altered by the practiced hand of someone who had once mastered the art of palace shadows. She was returning to her son's house, but she was not returning as royalty. Luna Vesper sat at the head of the long, mahogany council table, the heavy gold circlet pressed into her brow like a brand. It was only 8 months since her coronation, yet she felt as though she had aged decades under the crushing weight of expectation. To the court, she was merely the charity bride, the commoner who had snared a king. They did not see the nights she spent poring over trade ledgers until her vision blurred, or the way her hands trembled when she drafted letters to her mother, only to burn them moments later when the ink seemed too vulnerable, too desperate. The silence in the room was not peaceful, it was a weapon. Lady Belladonna Nightshade sat 3 chairs down, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as if she were waiting for something far more important than the Queen's input to materialize. Whenever Luna attempted to speak, a subtle, synchronized shifting of chairs, a cough, or a sudden, pointed conversation between 2 nobles would effectively drown out her voice. It was a masterpiece of social erasure. They never dared to be openly insubordinate, for King Orion's temper was legendary, but they had mastered the art of making the queen feel like a ghost haunting her own throne. Luna traced the grain of the wood with a fingertip, her pulse thrumming in her throat. She could feel their eyes, not looking at her, but through her. They were waiting for her to falter, to raise her voice in indignation, to provide them the ammunition they needed to whisper that she was unhinged, emotional, or unfit. So, she remained silent. She kept her chin lifted, her posture rigid, masking the exhaustion that gnawed at her spirit. The pressure was a physical weight, an invisible current pushing against her from all sides. Every corridor she walked echoed with stifled titters. Every gown she wore was criticized and hushed, cutting tones that carried just far enough for her to hear. She missed the simplicity of her old life, the way the wind felt in the village fields where no one cared for titles or bloodlines. Here, every breath she took was measured, every word she uttered dissected for signs of weakness. She knew, with a sinking dread, that they were waiting for her to break. They were banking on the hope that if they applied enough pressure, she would eventually simply wither away, leaving the path clear for someone of proper nobility. Luna tightened her grip on her skirts beneath the table, her knuckles white. She had promised herself she would be a queen worthy of Orion's love, but in this hollow, gilded cage, she was beginning to wonder if she would survive long enough to prove it. She looked toward the window, the autumn light filtering in, and for the first time, she truly understood that the palace was not a home. It was a battlefield, and she had been left to face the front lines entirely alone. Celestia stood in the periphery of the royal chambers, her head bowed in the practiced imitation of a lowly servant, yet her eyes were sharp as a hawk's. From her vantage point by the heavy velvet curtains, she observed the stifling atmosphere of the queen's private suite. It was a place meant for rest, yet it felt as charged and dangerous as a frontline trench. Ren, a slight girl with frantic, tired eyes, moved about the room with a singular, desperate focus. She was the only one who seemed to remember that a human being inhabited these rooms, rather than a political obstacle to be managed or removed. Ren knelt to adjust the hem of a gown, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were protecting the fabric from contamination. Celestia watched as the girl deftly sidestepped a group of senior maids who entered the room under the guise of delivering linens. The leader of the group, a woman with a sharp, pinched face, let her shoulder slam into Ren as she passed. It was a calculated, deliberate act of bullying, designed to make the girl stumble and drop the delicate silk she held. Ren didn't cry out. She simply absorbed the blow, her jaw set tight, and continued her work as if the indignity hadn't happened. Celestia's internal fury simmered. She watched as Ren approached Luna, who was staring blankly at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The maid's demeanor shifted instantly. She spoke in hushed, soothing tones, offering a cup of tea with a steady hand, despite the visible tremors of fatigue in her own limbs. Ren was a bulwark, a tiny, fragile shield placed between the queen and the relentless, creeping rod of the court. She meticulously checked the tea for any sign of tempering, a look of cautious suspicion in her eyes that spoke volumes of the constant, unspoken threats that defined their lives. When a spill occurred, intentionally caused by a lingering maid who lingered just long enough to sneer, Ren moved with lightning speed to mop it up before it could ruin the expensive rug. She was doing the work of 3 women, her own needs rendered entirely invisible so that Luna might have a moment of peace. It was clear to Celestia that Ren was the only thing preventing the queen from being entirely swallowed by the isolation the court had engineered. The girl was fraying, her edges worn thin by the ceaseless, petty warfare, yet she refused to abandon her charge. Celestia felt a strange, cold pride mixed with her outrage. She had come here expecting to find a neglected queen, but she had found a sanctuary built of nothing but one young woman's unwavering loyalty. It was a fragile, desperate thing, and it was the only piece of humanity left in this hollowed-out palace. Celestia leaned against the cold stone of the wall, noting every name, every subtle flick of a cruel wrist, and every moment of Ren's quiet, heroic defiance. She was gathering the pieces of the puzzle, and by the time the sun began its descent, she would have enough to bring the entire structure down. The palace hallways were labyrinthine, but for Celestia, they were as familiar as her own heartbeat. As Marta, she moved with an invisibility that only the overlooked truly possess. She slipped into the restricted administrative archives, a domain Lord Malachi Nightshade rarely bothered to lock, believing his arrogance to be a more formidable barrier than any iron bolt. Her breath hitched as she navigated the dim rows of ledgers, her fingers trailing over spines of cold leather until she reached the private files Malachi kept tucked behind a veneer of mundane tax records. The air here smelled of damp stone and stale ink, a fitting scent for a trader's den. She pried open a heavy, unassuming portfolio bound in dark twine. As she flipped through the pages, her pulse quickened. There, beneath a stack of legitimate grain invoices, lay the evidence of a deep, calculated rot. It was a collection of meticulously forged documents, correspondence that bore the seal of foreign emissaries, detailing a fictitious affair involving Queen Luna. The signatures were perfect, the ink aged with chemical precision, and the contents were designed to shatter King Orion's trust in his wife irrevocably. Malachi had been crafting a narrative of betrayal, planting seeds of doubt that would eventually bloom into a scandal so explosive it would necessitate Luna's immediate exile. Celestia felt a chill trace her spine, not of fear, but of absolute, freezing clarity. These papers were the final nail the Nightshades intended to drive into the coffin of the Queen's reputation. She leafed further, finding logs of payments made to palace servants for their complicity in sabotaging Luna's daily life. The cold meals, the ruined gowns, and the intercepted letters were not mere petty cruelties. They were part of a structured campaign to erode the Queen's confidence until she was broken enough to believe the lies they were creating. She carefully pulled the forged letters from the stack, her movements as precise as a surgeon's. Each page was a confession of high treason. Lord Malachi had been so smug in his belief that no servant would dare look, much less understand the gravity of these scrolls, that he had left them vulnerable. Celestia tucked the damning evidence into the folds of her apron, right against her skin. The weight of it was terrifying, a heavy, jagged truth that would soon be the catalyst for the destruction of the Nightshade faction. She replaced the remaining files with identical weight, ensuring no trace of her intrusion remained. As she stepped back into the dim corridor, the shadows seemed to bow in recognition. She had been a servant for only a few days, but she now held the power to topple 3 of the kingdom's most entrenched nobles. The plan was no longer merely to observe. The time for passive infiltration had expired. She knew exactly what Malachi and his sister were, and she knew the price they would pay by the setting sun. Her stride remained steady, her mask of servitude firmly in place, but her heart burned with the cold, bright fire of a queen mother who had finally found the thread to unravel her enemy's tapestry of lies. The twilight hour in the palace garden was usually reserved for the highborn to flaunt their status, but for Celestia, it served as the perfect theater for her enemy's undoing. She stood near the stone fountain, her head bowed as she polished a brass lantern, though her ears were tuned to the sharp, melodic laughter drifting from the gazebo. Lady Belladonna Nightshade was there, surrounded by a small circle of sycophants, her silhouette framed by the dying amber light. The air grew frigid as Belladonna began to speak, her voice dripping with a carefully cultivated venom that Celestia had heard too many times before. "The girl is a phantom," Belladonna mused, swirling a crystal flute as if it were a weapon. "She comes from a lineage of mud and field dust, and frankly, it shows in every clumsy step she takes across the throne room." Her companions tittered, a chorus of vultures awaiting their share of the carrion. Belladonna leaned forward, her face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. Does she truly believe that an Alpha King would keep her once he realizes she is a hollow ornament? She has no backbone, no pedigree, no dignity. I have spent these months peeling away the layers of her self-worth, watching her shrink into the shadow of a crown that will never truly fit her head. She is not a queen. She is an interloper in a world she was never meant to survive. Celestia's hand tightened on the lantern, the metal biting into her palm, but she forced herself to remain motionless. Every syllable Belladonna uttered was a confession. The lady spoke of the Queen's ancestry as if it were a disease, mocking the very foundation of Luna's upbringing with a casual cruelty that made the stone beneath Celestia's feet feel like it was cracking. It wasn't just dislike. It was a systematic project of erasure. Belladonna boasted of how she had intercepted the Queen's messages, how she had manipulated the staff, and how she had orchestrated the isolation that had left Luna weeping in the dark. The arrogance in Belladonna's tone was breathtaking. She believed she was untouchable, protected by the very silence she had imposed upon the palace. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of the hunt. "She will be gone by the next moon," Belladonna continued, her voice low and confident. "My brother has the papers ready to finalize the humiliation. Once we strip away the last of her pride, the king will cast her aside like a discarded toy, and the throne will finally be occupied by someone worthy of the title." Celestia didn't need to hear more. The confrontation she had sought in the shadows had delivered everything she needed, not just the evidence of treason, but the cold, undeniable proof of the hate that fueled it. The Nightshade faction had finally overreached. They had mistaken Luna's silence for weakness and Celestia's absence for indifference. As the lady walked away, her laughter trailing behind her like the rustle of a snake in dry leaves, Celestia stepped into the light of the setting sun. Her face was calm, stripped of the maid's subservient mask, and her eyes burned with the promise of the coming storm. The sunset was approaching, and by the time the moon rose, the beggars would be the ones asking for mercy. The shadows of the inner courtyard deepened, signaling the approach of the twilight hour, and with it, the necessity of the final move. Celestia navigated the hidden service passages, moving with the silent, predatory efficiency of a woman who had once commanded the very knights she was now seeking. She reached the barracks of the Royal Guard, a place of iron and sweat where her influence remained etched in the training regimens she had authored years ago. In the dim, flickering torchlight, she found Captain Valerius, a man whose loyalty to the Solara bloodline was as unyielding as the steel he carried. She stepped out from the gloom, shedding the hunched posture of Marta the maid as if it were a discarded skin. Captain Valerius turned, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his blade, but the motion froze the instant he recognized the sharp, commanding gaze of the woman before him. He dropped to one knee, the clatter of his armor echoing in the confined space, but Celestia held up a hand, a sharp gesture that forbade any formal acknowledgement. She spoke in a low, resonant tone that brooked no debate, outlining the systematic rot that had been allowed to fester within the palace walls. She did not need to shout. The weight of her authority, honed through decades of rule, was enough to command his total, breathless attention. She detailed the Nightshade Conspiracy, the forged documents, and the psychological warfare that had been waged against Queen Luna, her voice cold and lethal. The captain's face darkened, his jaw tightening into a grim line of fury as the reality of the betrayal hit him. He had watched the queen fade, confused by the palace's cold reception, and now, with the pieces laid bare, his indignation flared. Celestia instructed him to mobilize the most trusted units, the veterans who had served under her during the wars and who would never turn their backs on a Solara. They were to secure the perimeter of the throne room and prepare for a mandatory assembly before the sun dipped below the horizon. There were to be no questions, no leaks, and absolutely no interference from the Nightshade Guards. She ordered him to strip the conspirators of their influence in the corridors, ensuring that by the time the court gathered, the leverage they held would be entirely neutralized. As she spoke, she felt the familiar, invigorating hum of a kingdom operating under her command. It was a language she had spoken for a lifetime, and the transition from servant to architect of the coming reckoning felt natural. Valerius nodded once, a sharp, singular movement of absolute resolve, before turning to signal his lieutenants. As she stepped back into the shadows, Celestia felt the palace shift. The gears were turning, the trap was set, and the Twilight Assembly would mark the end of the era of whispers. The Nightshades believed they were the masters of this game, but they had forgotten that the true architect of the Blackstone throne had only been waiting for the opportune moment to strike. She smoothed her servant's apron, checking her reflection in a polished shield, and saw the reflection of a queen mother who was finally ready to reclaim her house. By sunset, the mercy they sought would not be found within the walls of this palace. The sun was a sliver of burning gold on the horizon when the heavy brass-bound doors of the throne room groaned and swung wide, not with the hesitant creak of a servant, but with the thunderous finality of a decree. The court, a sea of silks, jewels, and nervous whispers, fell into an instantaneous, suffocating silence. At the threshold stood a figure draped in coarse, mud-stained gray, a basin of water still gripped in one calloused hand. A ripple of confusion washed through the nobles, followed by the jagged edge of derisive laughter. Lady Belladonna Nightshade, seated near the dais, tilted her head with a predatory smirk, ready to sneer at the intruder, until she caught sight of the woman's eyes. Celestia Solara did not wait for them to process the impossible. With a fluid, practiced motion, she untied the ragged sash of her apron, letting the heavy, filthy fabric pool on the polished floor like a shed skin. Beneath the disguise, she wore the deep velvet mourning robes she had donned the day she left the capital, the deep crimson embroidery of the Solara crest catching the dying light of the sunset. She moved toward the dais with the measured, terrifying grace of a monarch returning to a hijacked kingdom. Behind her, the doors remained open, framing the grim, silent silhouettes of the royal guard, their blades drawn and eyes fixed on the assembly. The laughter died in the throats of the court, replaced by the sound of frantic, uneven breathing. Lord Malachi, who had been leaning casually against a pillar, straightened so quickly he nearly toppled, the color draining from his face, as if he had seen a ghost. Celestia climbed the steps of the throne, her presence expanding to fill the vast room until every noble felt small, exposed, and suddenly, violently aware of their own fragility. She did not look at the king yet. Her gaze was a frozen, piercing blade locked directly onto the trio of Nightshade siblings. She reached the center of the platform and turned, the heavy gold bands on her fingers glinting as she raised a hand to silence the room. The air felt thin, ionized by the sheer force of her arrival. She did not need to shout. The absolute stillness of her posture, the terrifying absence of fear in her expression, and the weight of her 30-year legacy commanded more reverence than any royal proclamation ever could. The nobles who had spent the last 8 months whispering in corridors now stood paralyzed, their faces etched with the realization that their game had been observed from the very beginning. Celestia took a single, deliberate step toward the edge of the dais, the silk of her skirts whispering against the stone like the warning hiss of a viper. She looked out over the assembly, her silence more devastating than 1,000 accusations, and in that moment, the entire court understood that the era of their petty cruelty had not just ended, it had been executed. The sunset had arrived, and the reckoning was finally at hand. Celestia drew a single, folded parchment from the folds of her velvet robe, the sound of the paper unfolding cutting through the tomb-like silence of the throne room. She began to read, her voice a calm, steady cadence that echoed against the vaulted ceiling, detailing the systematic cruelty directed toward Queen Luna with clinical precision. Each sentence was a hammer blow. She recounted the cold, inedible meals, the deliberate social sabotage, and the intercepted letters from the Queen's family. As she spoke, the names of the complicit servants were read aloud, causing the court to flinch as if struck. When Celestia reached the section detailing the forged documents, the fabricated correspondence designed to alienate the king and destroy a marriage, the room seemed to tilt. She turned her gaze toward Lord Malachi, who stood paralyzed, his composure shattered by the undeniable reality of his own handwriting laid bare. Celestia did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply listed the evidence of his treasonous conspiracy, holding up the forged seals for all to see. Beside him, Lady Belladonna's face, once composed in a mask of haughty superiority, crumbled into a gray, hollow mask of terror. The arrogance that had fueled their crusade against the Queen evaporated, leaving behind only the pathetic, cowering reality of their smallness. When Celestia finished reading, the silence that followed was heavy with judgment. She gestured to the royal guard, who stepped forward, their presence transforming from a protective ring into a cage. The realization of their absolute defeat hit the Nightshade siblings with the force of an executioner's axe. Lord Malachi fell to his knees first, the marble floor clattering beneath him, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He began to stammer, his voice thin and broken, pleading for a leniency he had denied the Queen for nearly a year. Beside him, Lady Belladonna followed, her fine silks dragging in the dust as she crawled forward, her hands outstretched in a futile, trembling gesture of supplication. They begged for mercy, their voices rising in a discordant chorus of self-preservation, their once sharp tongues now reduced to pleas for exile or a reprieve from the king's wrath. Celestia looked down at them from the dais, her expression devoid of pity. He turned his attention back to his mother, acknowledging her with a nod that contained a lifetime of unspoken gratitude, before addressing his wife once more. He pledged that from this moment forward, his protection of her would be absolute, and that anyone who dared to whisper her name with anything less than the deepest respect would answer to his blade. He ordered the guards to clear the hall of the sobbing conspirators, their pleas for mercy effectively silenced by the king's cold, ironclad resolve. As the room began to empty, Orion stood by Luna's side, his hand resting firmly on her waist. He had reclaimed his court and, more importantly, he had reclaimed his partnership with his queen. The palace would be rebuilt, brick by brick, purged of its cynicism and cruelty, until it was a place worthy of the woman he had married. He stared down the remaining nobles, his eyes promising a future where the king's justice would no longer be a rumor, but a terrifying, inescapable reality. The era of the common girl being treated as a ghost was over. The era of her reign had officially begun. The halls of the palace, once heavy with the stifling weight of whispers and malice, had breathed a profound sigh of relief as the seasons turned. A year had passed since the Twilight Reckoning, and the transformation of the Blackstone court was total. Under the watchful, guiding gaze of Celestia Solara, the palace had been scrubbed clean of the sycophants and opportunists who had thrived on cruelty. In their place, a new council had been established, composed of individuals who valued integrity over pedigree and who looked to Queen Luna not with the contempt of the past, but with genuine, earned respect. Luna herself had blossomed, no longer the trembling bride of the shadows, but a sovereign who moved through the corridors with the quiet, devastating grace of a woman who knew her own worth. She sat in the same council chamber where she had once been forced into silence, yet now the room hung on her every word. She had implemented social reforms that reached far beyond the palace gates, drawing on her own experiences as a commoner to champion the vulnerable and disenfranchised. Her empanada recipe had even become a celebrated tradition at state dinners, a small, stubborn defiance that reminded the court of her origins, a past she no longer hid, but wore as a badge of resilience. Celestia remained in the capital, not as a ruler, but as a mentor, sitting on the garden bench in the golden afternoon light, watching her daughter-in-law command the room with an intuitive, razor-sharp intelligence that mirrored her own. The bond between the two women had become the bedrock of the new era. There were no longer secrets between the king and his queen. The wall of isolation had been raised, replaced by a transparency that made their partnership an unshakable force. Orion ruled with a steady hand, his past failures serving as a permanent, humbling reminder of the cost of neglect. He doted on his queen, his devotion so open and raw that it silenced any remaining detractors, should they have dared to speak. The palace had found its peace, a quiet, humming stability that was no longer maintained by fear, but by a shared purpose. On her frequent, unannounced visits, Celestia would watch the interaction between the staff and the royals, noting the absence of the frantic tension that had once defined the queen's wing. Wren, now elevated to head of the household staff, moved with a proud, confident efficiency, the shadows in her eyes replaced by the bright certainty of a woman who was no longer fighting a war alone. The court was no longer a place of survival, it was a home, and the queen was its heart. As Celestia watched Luna laugh with her ladies-in-waiting, her face radiant with a happiness that was entirely her own, she felt the final, lingering tension in her own chest release. Her work was finished, and the crown, once so heavy, now sat perfectly upon the queen's head, worn by a woman who had survived the fire and emerged, in every way that mattered, as the finest ruler the kingdom had ever known.